Okay, we can start. So, hello everyone. Thank you for joining today's session. The topic we're going to discuss today is the anatomy of a defensible CECL reserve. Over the last several years, financial institutions have invested significant time and resources implementing CECL frameworks, developing methodologies, documenting assumptions, and integrating reserve estimation into quarterly financial reporting processes. So at this point, most institutions can successfully produce an allowance estimate. But increasingly, the important question is no longer whether a reserve can be calculated, it's more so, can the institution clearly explain why the reserve changes over time? So the following session will focus on the structural elements that determine whether a CECL framework becomes explainable, resilient, and defensible. And specifically, we'll discuss how inputs, segmentation, conditional assumptions, and modeling structure influence reserve behavior and governance outcomes. Ultimately, the goal is to understand what separates a reserve that simply complies with CECL from one that can competently be explained and defended. So before we begin, I'll briefly cover the session information and some learning objectives, and then I want to go over some important information regarding how you can earn 1 hour of continuing professional education credit for this program. To earn full credit, you need to attend at least 50 minutes of today's session. Additionally, we will be posting 4 polling questions throughout the webinar. You must answer at least 3 of these 4 questions to earn full credit. You do not need to answer these polling questions correctly. Simply answering them will be sufficient. Your CPE certificate will be sent to the email address that you registered with early next week. And also a quick reminder that I'll mention at the end, but at the end of this session, be sure to log out and then log back into the next session to make sure that you get the CPE credit for that session as well. So the presentation today is designed as an intermediate level program intended for professionals already familiar with the general CECL concepts and allowance estimation processes. Our focus today is not on implementation mechanics or accounting entries, but rather on the structural design decisions that influence reserve explainability and defensibility. So throughout the session, we'll examine why a lot of CECL frameworks struggle to clearly explain reserve movement, how stronger structural architecture can improve governance, transparency, and consistency. And specifically, we will discuss 4 pillars that contribute to a defensible reserve framework, which are the right inputs, the right granularity, the right conditional logic, and the right modeling structure. So you should also have access to the companion white paper associated with this presentation. Several of the concepts that we discussed today are going to be explored there in greater detail, and that can serve as a useful reference for the material after the session. So we'll start with a quick overview of the agenda. We'll start by discussing the current state of CECL implementation and why many institutions are now shifting their focus from implementation toward governance and explainability. From there, we'll examine what we believe is one of the central structural challenges within CECL today, and that is compliance without clarity. The majority of the session will then focus on the 4 pillars that determine whether a reserve framework becomes defensible. So first, we'll discuss the right inputs and the importance of capturing meaningful drivers of credit risk. Second, we'll cover the granularity and how segmentation will influence reserve accuracy and explainability. Third, we'll examine conditional logic and why assumptions should respond to borrower attributes and macroeconomic conditions. And then finally, we'll discuss structure, including why discounted cash flow frameworks preserve the timing and mechanics of expected loss. And so we'll conclude by discussing the characteristics of a truly defensible reserve framework, and then have additional questions and takeaways there. By this point, most financial institutions have completed the initial implementation phase of CECL. Quarterly reserve processes are operational. Methodologies have been documented, governance structures have been established, and allowance calculations are now embedded within the normal financial reporting cycles. From a compliance perspective, the industry is largely adapted to the accounting standard. But what has become increasingly apparent over the last several years is that implementation was only the beginning, and institutions are now entering a much different phase of CECL maturity, and one that is centered around governance, explainability, and defensibility. And the key questions institutions are asking today are different from the questions they were asking during implementation. Early on, the focus was largely on the operational aspects of which methodology should we use, how do we gather the necessary data, how do we document the framework. All of those questions have largely been answered, but now the focus has shifted toward interpretation of the reserve and governance. So why did the reserve change? Which assumptions drove the movement? How sensitive is the estimate to changing economic conditions? And does the reserve movement align with observable changes in portfolio risk? So these questions are significantly more difficult to answer because they require the CECL framework that is in place to reserve the underlying drivers of credit loss in a way that remains visible and interpretable. Increasingly, institutions are discovering that a CECL framework can technically comply with the accounting standard while still struggling to clearly explain actual reserve behavior and actual reserve movement. So the real test of a CECL framework is not whether it can produce a reserve estimate. At this point, most institutions are capable of calculating an allowance. Most modeling softwares and solutions available today are perfectly capable of giving you a number. But the more important question is whether the institution can clearly explain why the reserve changed from one reporting period to the next. Reserve movement can occur for many different reasons. So portfolio balances might grow, borrower credit quality might deteriorate, collateral values might decline, macroeconomic forecasts may worsen, prepayment expectations can change, and the timing of expected losses can also shift. And so a defensible framework should allow those drivers to remain visible within that reserve calculation. If the allowance increased because the institution originated a higher concentration of lower credit borrowers, then management should be able to identify and explain that relationship. And so the reserve movement was driven primarily by changing economic forecasts rather than changes in borrower credit quality. That distinction should also remain visible. And so this becomes critically important from a governance perspective because boards and auditors and regulators, senior management, all of these parties increasingly expect reserve movement to be explainable and to be understandable from one period to the next. And when reserve behavior becomes difficult to interpret, institutions often rely more heavily on the qualitative overlays and additional narrative explanations. And over time, that weakens confidence in the underlying framework or the underlying model itself. And so ultimately, a strong CECL framework should do more than generate just a simple number. It should translate the evolving credit risk into a reserve estimate that can be clearly interpreted, clearly governed, and clearly defended. And now, I have the first polling question here, and I will launch this in a sec. So the question is, what is the most common challenge institutions face after implementing CECL? And here are your polls. First is collecting data, running the model, explaining the reserve movement, or calculating historical loss rates. Couple more seconds here. Okay, perfect. So when CECL frameworks begin struggling with explainability, institutions tend to encounter a consistent set of governance and modeling challenges. One of the most common signs is the increasing reliance on qualitative overlays. And so to be clear, the qualitative adjustments are not inherently inappropriate. Judgment is always an important part of reserve estimation, particularly during periods of economic uncertainty or economic volatility, and also changing portfolio behavior. The problem is that when overlays become the primary mechanism through which the reserve responds to those changing conditions, so it often indicates that the structural framework itself is not fully capturing the underlying drivers of risk. Another common issue is the reserve volatility that appears disconnected from observable portfolio performance. So management might observe relatively stable delinquency trends, strong collateral coverage, or improving borrower performance, while the reserve estimate itself fluctuates materially due to broad assumptions or model limitations or outdated Q&E factors. So when this occurs, the reserve can begin to feel less like a reflection of the portfolio itself and less of a reflection of the portfolio behavior, and more like a byproduct of the mechanics of the selected model. Institutions also frequently struggle to decompose the reserve movement between reporting periods. And so the allowance will change, but it can't clearly be explained and can't clearly isolate how much of the movement was driven by portfolio growth, how much of the movement is driven by credit migration or changing economic forecasts or other assumption updates. Instead, the explanations become increasingly qualitative and generalized. So statements such as economic uncertainty increased or management adjusted assumptions, all of those can technically describe what have happened, but they fail to explain the structural mechanics behind the movement and behind what changed. So this creates a significant governance challenge because CECL is operating within this environment that is increasingly emphasizing the transparency and interpretability of the model and of the results. And so boards, auditors, regulators, everyone wants to understand what is driving those changes. We want to evaluate whether the assumptions behave consistently and logically, and we want to be able to assess whether the reserve movement aligns with evolving portfolio conditions and economic realities. And so as a result, the explainability has become one of the defining characteristics of a defensible CECL framework. Importantly, many of the problems are not caused by accounting compliance failures. In many cases, any institution is technically complying with ASC 326. The challenge is instead more of an architectural problem. So the framework doesn't preserve the relationships between borrower characteristics. It doesn't preserve relationships between collateral conditions. It doesn't include relationships related to exposure timing. There's no macroeconomic influence built into the model itself, and expected losses are not tied together in a way that remains visible over time. And so ultimately, when CECL becomes difficult to explain, the issue is not necessarily the output, it's more so the structural design of the framework that is producing that output. And so a defensible CECL framework should ultimately satisfy what I would describe as the governance test. So at a minimum, the framework should allow management to clearly answer three fundamental questions: what changed, why did it change, and how sensitive is the estimate to changing conditions? And so those questions sound relatively straightforward, but answering them consistently requires significant structural transparency within the reserve and within the modeling framework. For example, if the reserve increased during the quarter, management should be able to determine whether the movement was driven by portfolio growth, deterioration in borrower credit quality, changes in collateral values, shifts in macroeconomic forecasts, or changes in exposure timing. Ideally, the framework selected should preserve those relationships in a way that allows the institution to isolate and explain the contribution of each of those drivers. This is becoming kind of increasingly important because a lot of CECL governance is extending well beyond just the accounting compliance. It is often the largest estimate that's included on a balance sheet. And so boards need confidence that the reserve movement is aligning with actual portfolio behavior. We need to understand how the assumptions are constructed and how they influence the estimate itself. And then the methodologies are expected to behave logically and consistently with conditions as they evolve. So when a reserve movement cannot clearly be decomposed or explained, the confidence in the framework starts to weaken. And so institutions start to become more dependent on those qualitative overlays, on the broader narrative explanations, or on the manual adjustments just to reconcile the results from one quarter to the next. So ultimately, a strong governance framework depends on whether the reserve remains interpretable, as portfolio conditions and economic environments change over time. And so the architecture then of a defensible reserve rests on 4 interconnected pillars. The first pillar is the right inputs. So inputs will determine what the model can see. If the framework does not capture the variables that actually drive credit performance, the reserve will have limited ability to respond to those changing economic conditions or to changing risk conditions. The second pillar then is the right granularity. Granularity is going to determine what the model can distinguish. So even when the right inputs are available, meaningful risk differences can be lost if the loans are aggregated too broadly. Any averages can create the appearance of stability, but they can also obscure the true shape of credit risk within that portfolio. The third pillar then is the right conditional logic. Conditional logic determines how the model responds. So assumptions shouldn't remain static when the borrower characteristics, when the collateral values, or when macroeconomic conditions change. A defensible framework allows default, severity, and prepayment behavior to respond to those observable risk drivers as they change. And then the fourth pillar is the right structure. Structure will determine how the model explains the loss. And so a discounted cash flow framework preserves the sequence of credit loss by beginning with contractual cash flows, adjusting for prepayment, default, severity, and recovery timing, and then discounting those loan cash flows back to present value to determine what the expected or what the associated loss is. So none of these pillars are independent. They all reinforce one another and they all work together. And just weak inputs will limit what the model can detect. Poor granularity averages away the risk distinctions that those inputs are meant to capture. Static assumptions prevent the model from responding to changes in those risk distinctions, and a weak structure will compress exposure, it will compress timing and severity into a single point estimate that becomes difficult to explain. And so this is why CECL defensibility is not simply a matter of methodology selection or documentation, it's more of a matter of architecture of the entire framework. And so when the 4 pillars work together, the reserve movement becomes more transparent. The changes in the allowance can be tied to identifiable drivers such as portfolio growth or credit migration or changes in collateral or loss timing or macroeconomic conditions, whatever it may be. And when the pillars do not work together, reserve movement becomes much more opaque, and the institutions often compensate through overlays or qualitative explanations or after the fact or outside of the model reconciliation. And so the central message of this presentation is that a defensible reserve is not defined solely by the number produced. It's more so defined by whether the framework preserves the drivers of expected loss in a way that can be clearly explained, governed, and defended. So let's move right into the first pillar, which is the right inputs. Inputs determine what the CECL framework can actually see. And so no matter how sophisticated the methodology may be, the model cannot respond to risk drivers that are not captured. And if they're not structured and if they're not incorporated into the estimate, they will be entirely missed. So this is where institutions sometimes confuse data volume with data quality. So if we think about loan files, a loan file contains dozens of data fields or hundreds of data fields. An institution likely has years of historical performance information, but not every data point within that data set will have the same predictive value, and not every single piece of data in there will be valuable at all. So the key question is not how much data do we have? A much better question related to the data is which data elements actually explain credit performance. And so a defensible reserve will begin with the right inputs that reflect the true drivers of expected loss, which include borrower credit quality, collateral position, the exposure path, and macroeconomic conditions. And so without those inputs, the reserve movement is much harder to interpret, regardless of how the model is constructed and regardless of how polished the model itself actually appears. Expected credit loss is driven by a combination of behavior, collateral, performance, exposure timing, and economic conditions. And so for purposes of building a defensible CECL framework, I like to think about the key inputs in sort of 4 broad categories here. The first category is credit quality. This includes variables such as credit score, any internal risk rating, delinquency status, debt service coverage ratio, and historical payment behavior if it's available. All of these inputs will help the model assess the borrower's ability and willingness to repay. So credit quality is especially important because deterioration in borrower characteristics is often one of the clearest early indicators of future loss. So if credit scores decrease, we can expect an increase in associated losses. The second category is collateral position. So for secured lending, whether it's real estate or vehicles or commercial real estate, collateral plays a critical role in determining loss severity. And loan to value ratios, updated property values, vehicle values, collateral type, and any geographic exposure all influence expected recovery outcomes. So a borrower can default, but the ultimate loss is going to depend heavily on how much value can be recovered after that default. The third category is the exposure path. And so this is often a piece that's underappreciated or overlooked, depending on how you look at it. But expected loss shouldn't be applied to just a static balance without considering how that balance will change over time. So we have scheduled amortization, we have remaining term, we have any prepayment behavior, or any other payoff expectations. All of those things will affect the amount of exposure outstanding when losses are expected to occur. And then the fourth category is macroeconomic conditions. So variables such as unemployment, housing prices, interest rates, or any other sector-specific economic conditions will influence both borrower performance and collateral recovery. And so CECL requires reasonable and supportable forecasts, but the strength of the framework depends on whether those forecasts are connected to expected credit behavior in a logical way. So the important point is that all of these categories, again, will interact. Credit quality is going to influence default probability. The collateral position is going to influence severity. The exposure path is going to determine how much balance remains at risk throughout time. And the macroeconomic conditions will influence all of the relationships between those other three categories. So good CECL inputs are not just data fields, they work best as explanatory variables. They'll help answer the question of what changed in the portfolio and why should that change affect the reserve. And so if a model relies primarily on historical average losses, it typically will describe what happened in the past, but it's not very good at explaining how the current portfolio differs from that past experience. And then if collateral values are stale, severity assumptions are not going to be reflected. They're not going to reflect the current recovery expectations based on any changes in those collateral values. And then if borrower credit quality is not captured with enough precision or not updated frequently enough, the credit migration won't flow through to the reserve in a meaningful or measurable way. And so a defensible framework uses inputs that connect directly to the expected loss mechanics. It should be clear how much each major input will influence default, severity, and prepayment and exposure timing, or the economic sensitivity as well. And so when that connection is visible, the reserve movement becomes much easier to explain. So this is the second polling question. Which of the following is not a primary driver of expected credit loss? Launch that. Okay, moving on. So even when institutions have a functioning CECL process, a lot of input problems can still weaken the quality and the explainability of the reserve itself. And so one common issue, again, is reliance on overly broad historical averages. And so historical losses, it's an important experience and an important metric to track, but if the model depends too heavily on portfolio level averages, it will fail to capture how the current portfolio differs from the historical portfolio. Another common problem then is missing or incomplete credit attributes. So if credit score or if risk rating or delinquency status or debt service coverage ratios or any other borrower indicator related to credit, if those are unavailable or just inconsistently populated, the model itself is going to have limited ability to identify credit migration or to differentiate strong borrowers from weaker borrowers. Additionally, the collateral data can also create challenges. So stale property values, outdated vehicle values, missing loan to value ratios, or just limited segmentation in general related to collateral can weaken the severity estimates and make the recovery assumptions much harder to support and much harder to rely on. The macroeconomic inputs also can create a different issue. So a lot of institutions, a lot of frameworks will include forecasts, but the relationship between those forecasts and the expected credit behavior is sometimes weak or indirect. So in those cases, the economic scenarios might influence the reserve through broader overlays rather than through any modeled or mechanical relationship. And so the key point is that the weaknesses are not isolated, they will flow through the entire framework. And so weak inputs will limit segmentation, they'll weaken the conditional assumptions, and they'll make the reserve movement much harder to explain. So a defensible framework starts with a set of inputs that are complete, they're relevant, they're current, up to date, and they're clearly connected to expected loss. So then moving right on to the next pillar, pillar number 2, which is the right granularity. So if inputs determine what the model can see, the granularity is going to determine what the model can distinguish. An institution may have the right data elements available, but if the loans are grouped too broadly, those meaningful risk differences will disappear inside that average. So that creates a model that looks stable or it looks explainable, but it doesn't fully reflect the actual risk composition of the portfolio itself. So granularity then is about preserving the distinctions that matter. A framework should be able to recognize those differences in credit quality, should be able to recognize differences in collateral position, in loan structure, in vintage, in geography, delinquency status, and other risk characteristics that are meaningful and influential to that expected loss. And so at the same time, the goal is not just maximum segmentation for its own sake, because too much segmentation will create a lot of sparse data, a lot of volatility, and a lot of just false precision, being overly accurate while also perfectly imprecise. And so the goal is meaningful segmentation, which is enough detail to preserve the important risk differences, but enough discipline to keep the framework explainable, stable, and governable from one period to the next. The aggregation problem is one of the most important issues in CECL modeling and one of the most common problems we run into during CECL validations, because the aggregation can make the risk look a lot smoother than it actually is. And so when loans are grouped too broadly, the model will typically apply the same loss assumption to borrowers with very different credit characteristics. That certainly simplifies the calculation, but it also compresses any signal that might come out of the risk characteristics. So for example, assume a portfolio includes very strong borrowers, very average borrowers, and weaker borrowers. If all of those loans are pooled together and assigned a single expected loss rate, the model is no longer recognizing the underlying distribution of risk. So the stronger borrowers are going to have an overstated allocation, and the weaker borrowers are going to have an understated allocation. So the portfolio average will appear reasonable in total, but the model's lost the ability to explain what's really happening beneath the surface. And if any of those concentrations between strong, average, and weak borrowers, if those change from one period to the next, a lot of that information is lost or glossed over. And if there's more of an adverse shock, then we're very quickly becoming under-reserved. So it's especially important when the composition of the portfolio changes. If the institution starts originating more loans to weaker borrowers, or if existing borrowers migrate into those weaker credit tiers, a properly structured model should be able to respond to those movements. And so the reserve should reflect that change in risk composition. But if the portfolio is aggregated too broadly, the movement tends to be muted and tends to be delayed. The model continues producing a reserve that looks stable, even though the underlying risk has deteriorated completely. So this turns into, again, a governance problem where management knows that the portfolio has changed, but the reserve framework can't explain why, and it can't show the impact of that change. And so that disconnect makes it harder to explain results to the board, to auditors, to any regulators, just makes it much more difficult to defend. So aggregation is not always bad. In fact, some aggregation is typically necessary. It will help with some stability and when there is sparse data, and it does support just the usability of the results themselves by avoiding false precision. So excessive aggregation that averages away the risk distinctions that CECL is supposed to capture, but if it's too granular, then you have the opposite problem of you're producing a reserve based on sparse data and not very defensible framework. And so a defensible framework will preserve the major risk differences that drive expected loss. It doesn't mean every loan type needs dozens of segments within it, but it means that the segmentation should be designed around the factors that materially influence default, materially influence severity, prepayment, and exposure timing. So it's not necessarily adding in more complexity, but trying to add in more visibility to explain what those changes are. So when the granularity is appropriate, the model is then able to explain not only why the reserve changed, but also that's whether that's related to growth in the portfolio, changes in credit, changes in any collateral positions, or any other borrower performance metrics. So this shows kind of a simple example of how segmentation failure can distort portfolio risk. So assume we have a mortgage portfolio made up of 3 different borrower groups. The first group is prime borrowers with high credit scores and low loan-to-value ratios. Their true expected loss may be very low. The second group is more standard borrowers with moderate credit scores and moderate LTVs. Their expected loss is higher, but still very manageable. And then the third group is higher risk borrowers with lower credit scores and higher loan-to-value ratios. Their expected loss is meaningfully higher than the other 2 categories. If these 3 groups are evaluated separately, the portfolio risk is clear. The model will recognize that the prime segment should carry a lower reserve at 10 basis points. The standard segment will carry a more moderate reserve at 35 basis points, and the higher risk segment carries a much higher reserve at 120 basis points. But if all 3 groups are pooled together and we come up with the average loss rate, we end up with a 55 basis points applied across the entire portfolio. And so that looks reasonable at a portfolio level, but it creates 2 problems. The first is that it overstates risk for the strongest borrowers. Loans that should receive a relatively low expected loss assumption are assigned to that portfolio average, and they're over-reserved for. Second, and more importantly from a risk management perspective, is that it's understating the risk for the weaker borrowers. Loans with a materially higher default probability or a much higher severity risk are also assigned that same average assumption. And this is how aggregation kind of gives us that false sense of security. The total reserve looks mathematically supportable, but the model no longer reflects the actual distribution of risk within the portfolio. And when that distribution changes, if we add on higher risk loans, we would want to see the reserve increase, but if we use that average, we'd be farther under reserve. Similarly, in the other direction, if we focus primarily on prime credit and we add a bunch of prime credit loans to the portfolio, we're overstating the reserve that should be allocated to those loans. So if we rely too much on those averages, we're not fully capturing those risk distinctions. From a governance standpoint, so back to governance, this makes the allowance much harder to explain. You know that the credit mix has changed, but you're not able to explain it with the model you have in front of you. You have to do that qualitatively, and you have to do that with some type of narrative. Then the point here is not to say that every single loan in the portfolio has to be modeled individually. It's more so that the segmentation should preserve the risk distinctions that matter for producing credit losses. So a defensible framework, again, is able to distinguish between materially different borrower profiles so that reserve movement reflects changes in the actual portfolio and not just changes in the broad historical averages. Third polling question here. What is the primary risk of excessive portfolio aggregation? Okay, effective segmentation is about finding the right balance between risk sensitivity and sort of the practical governance piece. So a strong segmentation framework is going to be detailed enough to capture meaningful differences in expected loss, but not so detailed that the analysis becomes unstable, overly complex, or difficult to support. And so the best segmentation approaches are typically built around variables that have a logical and observable relationship to credit performance. And so for consumer loans, that typically will include credit score, delinquency status, obviously loan type, any collateral type supporting that loan, typically term, and also loan to value ratio if it's available. When we look at commercial loans, typically that includes any risk rating information, debt service coverage ratio, collateral type as well, industry exposure, property type, and then the geography itself. And so the key is that each segment should have a clear purpose. You should be able to explain why the segment exists and how it influences default risks, how it influences severity, how it influences prepayment behavior, and how it influences the timing or the exposure of those losses over time. So effective segmentation also has to remain governable. So back to governance again. If a segment is so narrow that there is a limited historical experience, the assumptions that are driving the projected losses for that will become volatile and again are going to require some excessive level of judgment. And so in those cases, typically we'll see broader groupings, some credibility weighting or additional supplemental reports with a defined empirical support with additional judgment on top of it. And so the objective is not looking to create overly complex or complicated models, but preserving the risk distinctions that drive any of the expected losses. So when we have effective segmentation, the reserve movement is easier to explain because changes in portfolio mix, changes in credit quality, changes in collateral, all of those will flow through the model in a structured and visible way. Takes us right to the third pillar, which is the right conditional logic. So if the inputs determine what the model can see and granularity determines what the model can distinguish, conditional logic then is going to determine how the model itself responds. And so this is where the framework translates those borrower characteristics, whether it's collateral position, all the exposure timing, macroeconomic conditions, all of those will be transformed into actual assumptions for default, for severity, for prepayment, and for loss timing. And so a model can have strong data and reasonable segmentation, but if the assumptions don't respond to those risk differences, the framework still becomes limited. So in that case, the model might identify that one borrower is riskier than another, but if it doesn't meaningfully reflect a difference in the reserve for those two borrowers based on conditional logic, then we're missing another component entirely. And so conditional logic is what connects the data that we have, the inputs and the granularity, to the estimate that we are producing. So a defensible framework won't treat all loans as if they behave the same way to changing conditions. It allows the assumptions to adjust as observable risk drivers change. And so static assumptions are one of the most common reasons that CECL frameworks become difficult to explain. A static assumption applies the same expected behavior across a broad group of loans, even when the underlying risk characteristics differ. For example, a model might apply one default rate to an entire loan pool, one severity rate to an entire collateral group, or one prepayment assumption across borrowers with very different incentive structures. This certainly creates a simpler process. It's easier to manage, it's easier to calculate, but it also limits the model's ability to respond to changes in risk. So borrower credit quality deteriorates, but the default assumption doesn't change. The reserve now no longer reflects the new risk profile of the portfolio. Similarly, if collateral values decline but severity assumptions are unchanged, expected recovery might be overstated. Similarly, if interest rates move materially up or down but prepayment assumptions remain static, then the exposure path no longer reflects the borrower behavior, and it no longer reflects expected changes in prepayments over time. So in all of those situations, we have to compensate through overlays or manual adjustments. Again, nothing inherently wrong with using those tools, but when they become the main way that the model responds to risk, the framework becomes much harder to govern. And so a defensible framework should embed responsiveness directly into the model rather than relying primarily on those after the fact adjustments. So conditional modeling is the next step beyond simply identifying the risk differences. It means the model uses those differences to adjust the assumptions that drive expected loss. In a conditional framework, conditional meaning conditional on the credit attributes of the loan, the assumptions are not fixed at the same level for every borrower or for every environment. They will change based on observable risk drivers. So default assumptions will vary based on credit score. They should vary based on risk rating or delinquency status. If it's a commercial loan, the default assumptions should change based on debt service coverage ratio or any additional leverage metrics. And additionally, they should adjust throughout time, throughout the forecast, based on changes in macroeconomic stress. Severity assumptions will typically vary based on loan to value, collateral type, any updated property values, if it's a different type of collateral and there's a known recovery cost, as well as liquidation timing. So it's the timing for liquidation is not the same for every loan product, and it's not the same in every geography either. Prepayment assumptions will vary based on rate incentive. They'll vary based on age. They will vary based on borrower behavior, on product type, and general market conditions. So the important point is that the model is responding to characteristics of the loan and the environment around it. For example, a borrower with a strong credit profile, so a high credit score, and a low loan to value ratio should generally receive a different expected loss assumption than a borrower with a weaker credit score and a higher LTV. If it's a commercial real estate loan with a strong debt service coverage ratio above 1.5, coverage should not be treated as the same as a loan with a maybe debt service coverage ratio closer to 1 or even below 1. If it's a mortgage at a rate well below the current market rates, typically it's going to have a low expectation for prepayment as opposed to one that is either much closer to the market rate or one that is higher than the market rate. So it depends on the refinancing incentive. If there's a strong incentive to refinance, that should be captured within the risk characteristics of that loan. So conditional modeling is not saying the model's becoming overly complicated or loses the judgment. What it's doing is the exact opposite of that. It builds discipline, it builds judgment right into that by making the relationship between those risk drivers and those assumptions much more explicit, much more consistent, and much more reviewable over time. And so, a quick way to think about it is to say if it's a higher credit loan, it should have a lower default rate than a lower credit loan. That builds that what often is used as judgment, that empirically builds that right into building those assumptions. And so that's important for us and for other financial institutions as well, because of the governance aspect. It gives us a clear explanation for changes in the reserve. If the reserve increases, we can point to specific changes. So whether that's deterioration in credit scores, downward migration in risk ratings, increases in loan to value ratio, decreases in used vehicle values, increased forecast for unemployment, or changes in prepayment expectations based on where market rates are. So the result of all of that is a framework that behaves more like the portfolio itself. And so as borrower risk changes, default assumptions change. As collateral protection changes, severity assumptions change. As prepayment behavior changes, exposure timing changes. And as economic conditions change, the expected loss path also changes. So it's the core value of conditional modeling is that it's creating a direct connection between the risk characteristics captured in the data, in the inputs, and the reserve estimate produced by the model, which makes the allowance easier to explain, easier to govern, and easier to defend. And so this illustrates how the conditional assumptions change the way a CECL framework reflects borrower level risk. So assume we're looking at borrowers with within the same general loan category under a static framework. Each borrower may receive the same default assumptions simply because they belong to the same pool. The stronger borrower and the weaker borrower set up here in both a stable environment and a recessionary environment. In the example here, the stronger credit borrower has a high credit score and a low loan to value ratio. That borrower has both stronger repayment capacity and stronger collateral support. And so a conditional framework will recognize this. It will recognize that profile and assign a lower default assumption. The weaker borrower has a much lower credit score at 640 and a higher loan to value ratio at 90%. This is much less financial flexibility and much less collateral protection. So in a conditional framework, again, the default assumption increases much more to reflect the elevated risk. And so if we look at a stable economy, the strong borrower has a conditional default rate of 40 basis points versus the high risk borrower at 280 basis points. If we're in a recessionary scenario, so higher unemployment, potentially higher inflation as well, less capacity to make prepayments, more likelihood of default. Stronger borrower, still higher credit score, more asset protection, likelihood of default's much lower, but still higher than stable economy. But if we look at the higher risk borrower in that same recessionary scenario, we have a much larger increase from one environment to the next based on that already high loan to value ratio and the already low credit score, because it just continues to eat away at their ability to make those payments. And so the conditional assumptions make the responsiveness visible within the model itself. And without the conditional logic, it's much harder to explain any of these changes, and they all typically will end up being explained through overlays or after the fact adjustments. So with the conditional logic, the explanation is built into the framework itself, and the model is able to connect observable credit characteristics to expected default behavior, which creates a clearer and much more consistent defensible estimate. And so conditional logic matters because it will determine whether the CECL framework behaves like a true risk model or simply produces an accounting estimate. A static model will produce a reserve, but it struggles to explain why the reserve should change as portfolio conditions will change. The conditional logic gives the framework a mechanism to respond when the underlying risk profile shifts. For example, again, if credit scores deteriorate, default assumptions will generally increase. If collateral values decline, we'll have an increase in severity assumptions. If interest rate change and prepayment behavior slows, the model will recognize that. The exposure remaining outstanding over the projection period will change based on the change of prepayments. And again, if macroeconomic forecasts weaken, the expected credit performance will adjust in a structured and supportable way because everything is conditional based on the attributes of the loans themselves. So this is all creating a stronger connection between the observable risk drivers and the reserve movement. And from a governance standpoint, again, conditional logic is also improving the explainability of the model. So instead of relying on overlays, we can point to specific conditions that changed and how those conditions affected the expected losses. And so ultimately, the conditional logic is what allows CECL to become a forward-looking exercise and much more forward-looking in substance as opposed to just a number. It allows the reserve to respond proportionally to changes in borrower risk and changes in collateral strength and changes in economic conditions. Then moving on to the fourth pillar, the last of the four pillars is the right structure. And so at this point, we've discussed inputs, we've discussed granularity, we've talked about conditional logic. Those elements determine what the model can see, what it can distinguish, and how the assumptions respond to changing risk conditions. But the structure of the model determines how those assumptions are translated into the allowance estimate. So this is especially important because credit loss is not a single period event. Loans will amortize, borrowers will prepay, defaults will occur at different points in time, and recoveries will occur months later. Additionally, collateral values can change before liquidation, and so the timing of loss matters as well. A defensible framework needs a structure that can preserve those relationships instead of compressing them into a single average loss rate. And that's why discounted cash flow modeling can be so powerful. It connects contractual cash flows, it connects expected borrower behavior, it connects default timing, severity, recoveries, and present value all into one coherent framework. Loss timing is critical and captured in discounted cash flow, and it matters because it's expected, because expected credit loss is not only about whether the loss occurs, it's about when the loss occurs and how much exposure remains outstanding at that point in time. So two loans can have the same original balance, the same interest rate, and even the same lifetime default expectation, but they can produce different reserve outcomes depending on the timing and prepayment and amortization and the recovery. So for example, a default expected in the first year of a loan's life is very different from a default expected in year 7. If it's in year 1, the outstanding balance typically is close to the original amount, but by year 7, the loan typically will have amortized much more significantly, or the loan could have prepaid entirely, erasing the exposure altogether. Severity also has a timing component. So a loan can default in one period, but the actual loss likely is not going to be realized until that collateral is liquidated or until the recoveries are actually received. So during that time, more often than not, collateral values can change quite a bit. Recovery costs can accumulate, and the ultimate loss amount typically will differ quite a bit from the initial estimate. The prepayment behavior also affects loss timing. So if borrowers prepay faster than expected, the institution will have less exposure outstanding when those future defaults would have occurred. And if prepayments slow down, that exposure remains on the books longer, which increase the amount of balance subject to those future credit losses. And this is kind of where a simpler lifetime loss methods start to break down or become limited, is that they estimate total expected loss, but they often compress all of the relationships between timing, default severity, and recovery into one single rate. That can be sufficient for some portfolios, but it also makes reserve movement much harder to explain when borrower behavior or economic conditions change. And so a discounted cash flow framework helps preserve the timing of expected loss. It begins with the cash flow path, adjusts for expected prepayment, default severity, recovery timing, and discounting as well. And so that structure matters because CECL is, we're not just asking how much loss may occur over the life of the asset, it's asking how much expected credit loss forms over time. And so when the timing of loss is visible, the reserve becomes much easier to understand, explain, and defend. So I'll skip that one and go just right to the, this is a simplified example of how a discounted cash flow or DCF schedule will translate loan behavior into expected credit loss. The purpose of this schedule is not to suggest that every CECL model has to look exactly like this, but more so just to show the logic of how the framing and the time work together. We begin with the beginning balance. So this represents the amount of exposure outstanding at the start of the period. From there, the model reflects the contractual principal to be received under the amortization schedule. Then we apply an expected default amount for the period. This is where the logic is becoming important. The default assumption should reflect the credit characteristics of the borrower, of the loan type, of the delinquency status, and the macroeconomic environment, as well as any other risk drivers. Next, we have the prepayment assumptions. So prepayment will reduce the balance faster than the scheduled amortization. This is important because once principal is prepaid, it's no longer exposed to that future default. And then once the default is estimated, we apply that loss severity. So severity is the portion of the loan, the portion of the defaulted balance that is not expected to be recovered. So if the loan defaults at $200 and the expected severity is 40%, the loss for that period is going to be $80. And so that's a combination of the default and severity. So this discounted cash flow framework is kind of, from a governance standpoint, is where it matters a lot, is that the schedule gives management, auditors, reviewers, gives everyone a way to trace the reserve from assumptions to cash flow impact to present value. It also creates a framework for sensitivity analysis, and then we can test what happens if these assumptions change over time. The larger point is that expected credit loss is a function of exposure, probability, severity, and time, and a discounted cash flow framework keeps those components separate enough to understand, but also integrated enough to produce one coherent allowance estimate. So polling question number 4, last one here. Why is discounted cash flow modeling important in CECL? All right, so defensible reserve has several recognizable characteristics. First, it's explainable, so management can describe not only what the allowance is, but why it's changed. Reserve movement can be traced to identifiable drivers such as portfolio growth, credit migration, collateral changes, macroeconomic forecasts, prepayment behavior, and assumption updates. Second, it is responsive. The reserve should change when the underlying risk profile changes. If borrower credit quality deteriorates, collateral value will weaken, or if economic forecasts worsen, the framework should respond in a logical and supportable way. Third, it is stable in a coherent way. So stability doesn't mean that the reserve never changes. It means that the movement is proportional, explainable, and connected to changes in risk. And then fourth, it is decomposable. We can break down reserve movement into meaningful components rather than relying only on those broad qualitative explanations. And then finally, it is also governable. So boards, auditors, regulators, and senior management should be able to understand the framework enough to challenge the assumptions and to evaluate the results and assess whether the allowance reflects portfolio risk. And so a defensible reserve is defined by whether the framework preserves the drivers of expected credit loss in a way that can be consistently explained, reviewed, and defended. And so the key takeaway from today's session is that CECL defensibility depends more on producing a reserve calculation. Most CECL frameworks can generate an allowance estimate. The stronger frameworks can explain why that allowance moved, and it can explain what risk drivers change, and it can explain how those changes flowed through to the reserve. The first pillar is inputs. The inputs will determine what the model can see. So if the framework doesn't capture the true drivers of credit loss, it can't fully explain the reserve behavior. The second pillar is granularity. Granularity determines what the model can distinguish. And so effective segmentation preserves meaningful differences in borrower risk, in collateral strength, in exposure timing, and in portfolio mix. The third pillar is conditional logic. Conditional logic will determine how the model responds. So assumptions should adjust when credit quality, when collateral values, when borrower behavior, or when macroeconomic conditions change. And then the fourth pillar is structure. So structure determines how the model explains expected loss. A discounted cash flow framework is powerful because it preserves the timing and sequence of exposure, of prepayment, of default and severity and recovery and present value. So ultimately, a defensible CECL reserve framework is one that remains explainable, responsive, decomposable, governable as portfolio conditions change. So it's about explaining why that reserve moves. And so I'll close this section with the central message of the presentation, which is a CECL reserve is only as defensible as the framework behind it. So the allowance number matters, of course. It affects earnings, capital, financial reporting, board oversight, audit review, and regulatory evaluation. But the number by itself is not enough. The real value of CECL and of using a framework is its ability to explain how expected credit loss is forming within the portfolio. So the final thought is that a CECL reserve or a defensible reserve is defined by whether the framework can explain reserve movement in a way that is logical, supportable, and connected to the economics of credit risk. And so thanks again for your time and participation today. I appreciate the opportunity to walk through all of these. The main point I hope you take away is that it's about building a framework that can explain the number. So that's preserving the connection between inputs, segmentation, assumptions, and structure. Just please be sure to log out of this session and then log into the next session to ensure consistent CPE tracking. I did go a little over on time, but I am happy to answer some questions if anyone has any at this time. So one question is, it seems that we feel the discounted cash flow method is the only defensible one. Is that correct? Mostly correct. We think it is the most defensible one, and we think it is the one that preserves all of the risk drivers that should be captured in a CECL model. One is our very specific loan level data markers, such as credit score migration or collateral value, applicable in both a DCF and a WARM model. I would say yes. The WARM model is the math of determining the reserve is going to be more simplistic than in a discounted cash flow model, but the segmentation can be very similar, where if you are segmenting by credit score and collateral value, you'll be able to capture those changes or the migration over time as you continue to use that model going forward. I think that was it. So thank you, everyone. If anyone has any questions, feel free to email me, and I'm happy to respond. Thanks again.